Good afternoon from central London, and this is a unscheduled, unprecedented live video. We normally do our ones on a Wednesday afternoon, but given the big news, especially if you're a landlord or an investor, you'll know that the Renters' Right Bill, and of course, the repackaged, rebranded Renters' Reform Bill, which the Conservatives had originally announced back in 2019 as part of their manifesto. So that has now passed through Parliament. It's been presented to Parliament. And this is the talk of the week. I've been having a lot of conversations with landlords and investors as to what that means, what's different there. And today's video is just to dissect that, and we're going to dive in deep. So stay tuned. We're also going to be talking about the impact of just the general intervention of government when it comes to rental properties. And there's always, I promise, there is always unintended consequences. So before I start, as always, I just want to make sure that anyone who's joining can hear me properly, can also see me properly. Make sure there are no tech issues, and that would be great. This is going to be recorded, so anyone who's perhaps just jumping in after can have a look. Andrew, great to see you back on, and thank you for confirming that you can hear me loud and clear. So on Wednesday, as you guys know, the Renters' Right Bill has been presented to Parliament, and there is a lot of talk about it and a lot of speculation as to what's going to happen, whether buy-to-let is now dead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight into and dive in to these articles. For some reason, my Stream Deck is not working. Pressing to get, oh, here you are. Okay, I'm in. So hopefully you can see my screen, and what we're going to be looking at is understanding the Renters' Rights Bill, what letting agents need to know, but also what landlords need to know, a transformative system of periodic tenancies. Now, before we jump into the major changes, at least, which if you've been following the Renters' Reform Bill, which was originally presented by the Conservative, there isn't huge changes, but there are very subtle changes. And those subtle changes is, of course, from Labour sprinkling in a little bit of a left-wing twist to what the original reform bill was. But before we go there, it's important to understand where this came from, when it started, and what's happened since. So back in 2019, as part of the manifesto of the Conservative Party, they did want to bring in what was called the Renters' Reform Bill. And it's been sort of 5 years, and ultimately, before they were kind of chucked out of number 10, they failed to put this through. And so this is where Labour has picked up the bill and again sprinkled a little bit of left-wing policies on it and called it their own, rebranded, repackaged it, and it's now as the Renters' Right Bill. Now, I might be unpopular by saying this, but it's the truth. A lot of landlords are actually rather relieved. Why is that? Well, if you can imagine, we've had 4 or 5 years of noise about this bill coming through, and it hasn't. And people or landlords have been making decisions, financial decisions, based on pure speculation. And for example, we had some changes that were announced that were going to be implemented when it came to the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate. And a lot of landlords didn't want to invest in their property to bring it to the standard that the government said that they were going to bring in. And that never happened. And so finally, hopefully, once this is actually passed, then landlords and investors can make informed decisions on real facts as opposed to speculation. And that could be the landlord saying, you know what, I don't like all these policies. It doesn't work for me. It's too much of a risk, more than I care to muster for, and therefore I'm out. Or it could be, well, actually, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Perhaps speak to property consultants, probably speak to solicitors and think, you know what, I can make this work. So that's the relief that a lot of landlords are seeing, and I'm speaking to at least, where they're saying, can we now come out of this gray area and now start working on real facts? And we can decide on what we want to do moving forward. And I know there's been a lot of lobbying, even Property Mark sort of pushing to make this work, as to, push this over the line. So with that being said, let's go on to understanding the Renters' Rights Bill. So what we have here is an article from Property Mark, and we're looking at grounds for possessions and everything else. When I first jumped on, I talked about unintended consequences, and we can see how this is played out with other different policies. Not so much the reform bill, but if we look at the 2016 announcement from the Conservative, and again, a lot of people are talking about the Labour Party, and how unfriendly they are. But let's not forget, when it comes to the Conservatives, there was a lot out there that was not landlord friendly. And I want to share this article with you because this shows the impact of Section 24. And again, what these unintended consequences bring. So hopefully you can see this, Property Mark, the impact of Section 24 on the buy-to-let landlords. The finding of this ultimately was that rent increased, and it wasn't only based on the Section 24. It was also based on legislation when it came to the tenancy fee ban of 2019. That had a direct impact. The findings are here. It's in black and white. That had a direct impact when it came to rental increasing. Section 24, landlords not being able to offset their expenses from their mortgage interest. Again, that had an impact on tenants. So the government isn't really doing any favors to tenants by putting these policies. There's always going to be a cause and effect, and unfortunately, the negative effect is perhaps, I would say, primarily probably go into the landlord, but then that's passed on to the tenants. I know from an agency point of view, at least, when it came to the tenancy fee ban, I know that the agents weren't going to bear that cost either, and that was passed on in form of rental increase. And what we're going to see, and I'll leave this for later, is how this is going to continue to increase the rent as these policies come into effect. So going back to the understanding the renters reform. So first up, we got grounds for possession. A 12-month protected period will be introduced at the beginning of a tenancy, during which landlords cannot evict their tenants in order to sell or move into the property. A 4-month notice period will be required for these grounds. So again, we already knew this, nothing sort of huge here. We already knew that when it came to ongoing tenancies, this was going to be a 12-month period whereby you could not evict your tenants, whatever the grounds. And we're going to get into the Section 21 and what grounds are going to be available to landlords. But landlords can no longer evict tenants without a valid reason. Tenancies will become infinite and can only end after 1 year with 4 months' notice if the landlord wants to sell or move. Eviction due to non-payment requires proving serious arrears. Now, what does that mean, serious arrears? Well, in the eyes of the law, and with this new legislation that may come into place, is going to be 3 months, and that's up from the existing 2 months. And my understanding is after the 3 months, you've got to give I believe it's 2 weeks or 4 weeks notice to the tenant, and then obviously the court process starts. Now, the issue with that is the following. So this removal of Section 21 isn't the major challenge, which I've been speaking to a lot of agents, solicitors, people in the industry, and some landlords that perhaps have a lot of experience in the industry. But the major issue is the fact that the court systems are simply not up to date. Because what we're seeing is landlords who are evicting tenants for very good reasons are taking 9 months, and even beyond. I know one particular landlord that's been over a year, and the challenges and the stress that that brings to himself, his family, his business, it's huge. So we're all human beings here. I can empathize with tenants, but also certainly with landlords, and ultimately why the landlords even have these properties in the first place, right? They don't have it for the fun of it. If you are a landlord watching this, please feel free to leave a comment. Let me know what your experience is and what your plans are given this new renters' right bill that's been presented. So what I wanted to see here was looking at the impact of Section 24, reforming the PRS landlord reviews. So this is an important part because as I said, in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a lot of noise of renters reform. And there was a survey done by Property Market, and I believe this was back in 2019 or 2020. Nevertheless, this is September 2024, March 2024. So they asked landlords as to what they thought for themselves was the biggest issue with these reforms coming into place. And some of the biggest things were here. There's no surprise here that the removal of Section 21 is the one that landlords were most concerned about. So here, table one, measures within the renters reform bill which concerns landlords the most. And 72%, this is at the top, said it was the removal of Section 21. So it's losing a degree of control, I guess, from a perspective of a landlord. To be honest with you, I would wonder, I would be very curious, out of these 72% who have raised these concerns, how many of these have actually had to serve a Section 21? Or is it just a peace of mind, a kind of get out of free jail card that's good to have? And that's what worries them, because the Section 8 does provide other grounds. So should you need your property back to have it back in as your home, should you need it for a family member, anything like that, should you want it to sell it because your financial situation has changed, there are many grounds that you can use under that section. So and if you're a professional landlord, there's no other reason why you will want that property back. Yes, there may be some landlords who perhaps have just a couple of properties, I say just, but have a couple of properties and perhaps want to have more flexibility. But that will be interesting to find out, because I don't know many landlords who do serve Section 21. Now, 69% of concerns was the end of fixed term tenancy. So, of course, this is this indefinite or this infinite ongoing tenancies. So effectively, all tenancies will go on to a statutory periodic tenancy. So the fact that whereby you wanted to close in and box in a tenant for a period of 2 years or 3 years because you wanted certainty and you didn't want to look for a tenant in the next 12 months, that's gone. That ship has sailed. Okay, it's not printed, it's not been signed off, it's been put to Parliament, but that's where we're going. I think it's a matter of not if, but when, and that's going to come to an end. And of course, with that is going to come to an end with tenants paying the rent in advance. Because one thing we see here in prime London a lot is a lot of tenants paying 12 months in advance. I mean, I saw a tenant just the other day paying £45,000 in advance for a rent, and I believe that rent was something along the lines of £4,000 per month. And of course, those type of tenants that definitely have the pockets. That being said, it's going to be incredibly challenging for you to justify taking 12 months rent in advance if by law there doesn't exist a 12-month tenancy. So as we start getting more updates as to what this legislation means, we certainly will provide more information for landlords so you can find out how, if possible, you can maneuver through this new legislation, which again is a matter of when rather than if. So going back to the biggest concerns that landlords have, so you've got the removal of rent review clauses. So that's going to be part, of course, and I'm going to go into a little bit into that. The introduction of an ombudsman scheme. I don't see why many landlords should be concerned about this one, to be honest with you. At the moment, every agent needs to be signed up with a ombudsman. The fact that currently, if a tenant goes directly to a landlord, then the landlord can somehow bypass being with a ombudsman, and the tenant doesn't have the same type of protection. It seems crazy to me. So I think this is something that should be welcomed. From a landlord's perspective, looking at it this way, from a landlord's perspective, they're professionalizing the industry even more, giving perhaps more credit, giving more of a standard to the industry as a landlord, rather than being sort of a cowboy industry. Now you can be signed up to an ombudsman, and if you've done something that the tenant thinks is unfair, they can bring it to the ombudsman. Why not? The creation, so the lowest one given based on this report is the creation of a private rented property portal. And of course, this will work very much whereby landlords will need to register with a portal, and all the information will be held there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So far we have talked about those infinite tenancies ongoing, but then let's go and find out what else is in this bill. So the transformative system of periodic tenancies. So the argument put forward by UK government is that removing fixed term tenancies and instead allowing tenants to end the tenancy with 2 months notice will give renters more flexibility to move if their circumstances change. For example, due to a new job, a relationship breakdown, or because they bought a home of their own. They also point to situations where tenants are obliged to continue paying rent for a substandard property until the end of the annual contract. So this is quite crazy because, of course, this is very much moved towards the tenant. Now, the landlord, if they have a contract, and that contract is with the tenant, and the landlord can then plan in advance. If they know the tenant is there for 12 months, 18 months, it's a fair deal. It's a win-win deal. The tenant is committing to something, and so is the landlord. You don't see this in any other industry. It's not like I don't know, a gym membership, right? A gym membership, you sign up for 12 months, and it's not like the government is intervening and saying, hey, hang on, there is a get out clause here, because if your situation changes, then you should be able to just change. That seems crazy to me, that the government is specifically targeting landlords. Like, landlords are the problem for the rental crisis, and far from it. We do know that the housing crisis and the biggest issue is the lack of supply, especially here in London. I mean, for years here in the capital, the government and the mayor has failed to provide adequate amount of properties for the growing population. The population continues to grow, and the housing just simply does not keep up pace. And now we have, of course, the Labour government saying, well, we're going to build 1.5 million properties over the course of 5 years, which simply is not going to happen. I think if they do the right things, potentially sort of beyond the 5 years, things will be easier when it comes to planning and so forth. We have a few questions here, so let me just go through some of these here. I've got Samantha. Are there any fines for non-compliance with the new renters bill, and best ways to avoid them? That's a good question. So first of all, the bill hasn't passed yet, Samantha, so just want to clarify that. It has been presented to Parliament, but as we all know, it's going to go through sooner rather than later. And I can update you in terms of how to maneuver through these. But the answer is yes, of course, there will be fines. I mean, if you want to find out more about current fines and how landlords are being fined left, right, and center, feel free to watch my most recent video, was out last week, where we talk about fines of up to £99,000 for a very specific non-compliance. We got another one here from Andrew. Danny, will it be great if you can explain how does the ban on rental bidding wars work, and what does this mean for landlords when setting rent prices? So great question. So listen, currently we are in a situation here in London, at least, whereby there are rental bidding wars. There's just no way about it. You put a property on the market, you put it on market at market price, and you have a substantial amount of people come through, and without the agent even asking the tenant to put a higher price, the tenant willingly asks and says, I want to put an over asking price because I want to secure this, because I know how competitive it is, right? That's what's happening at the moment. Now, the way that we see this sort of playing out is that the government is very much putting a ban on agents or landlords encouraging this practice. So an agent wouldn't perhaps be able to say, hey, Mr. Tenant, we have another tenant or renter. Hey, Mr. Renter, we have another renter who's keen on the property. They've put a price, a bidding price of £2,500 on this £2,000 property. Do you want to beat that price so we can present it to the landlord? That's going to be something that's going to be against the law. And this reminds me of our American cousins. And I know about this because there are a lot of Americans that come here. And when they find out that, currently at least, that the landlord is wanting above the asking price, they can't get their head around it. They're amazed. What does that mean? But the rental price is X, and we're like, yeah, the rental price is X, but the landlord wants Y, because we have other renters who are really wanting this property. It's really in demand, and clearly the market price is undervalued. And they can't get their head around that. And that's because in America, it's also illegal. It's illegal right now. You could not rent the property above the asking price that you put the property on the market for. Now, that's going to present several challenges because, as I said at the very beginning, there are also always unintended consequences when it comes to government intervention. And we've seen this with the stamp duty increase for second homes. We've seen this with the implementation of Section 24 and the banning of you being able to offset your mortgage interest payments. We've seen unintended consequences also when it came to the 2019 tenant fee ban, which I mentioned before, and that fee was just incorporated into the rent. And so the rent increase is just that simple. This reminds me of a story with the British Empire, whereby, whether it's true or not, they arrived there and they had cobras sort of killing quite a few soldiers, and they were fed up with it. Told the locals, hey, locals, we'll give you a reward for every dead cobra that you bring in. And the locals, showing somewhat some entrepreneurship spirit, started to breed the cobras and started having hundreds and hundreds of cobras and bringing them to the British soldiers, to the British Empire, and they were getting rewarded. And then the actual British Empire found out about it and said, well, actually, no, we're not doing this anymore. And therefore, what did the locals do? What we're going to do with all these cobras? They released it to the wild, made the problem even bigger than what it was originally doing. And again, whether you appreciate this story or not, I'm trying to drive a point here. The government almost always is going to be a cause and an effect. So, going back to understanding the renters bill, I digressed there in terms of Danny, the bidding wars. So the bidding wars. So how those bidding wars are going to work is very much there's going to be a rental price that you set, and pretty much you're not going to be able to influence or I was going to say manipulate, but you're not going to be able to drive a higher price than that. I think if it comes organically, then fair enough, but you wouldn't be able to push for it. we'll have more details on that, Andrew, as it comes in. But I hope that that is helpful. But what I do foresee happening with that is very much landlords wanted to make sure that they don't undervalue the property, and so therefore they're going to increase they're going to increase the price substantially to make sure to not come away sort of reluctantly feeling that they somehow undervalue the property. Because let's say, as an example, as a landlord, you market the market value you think it is around about, let's say, 2.5 grand. That's what you think it is. You put it up at 2.5 grand and you have 20 offers. From your perspective as a landlord, you're like, oh, I should have went higher, because if I'm getting 20 offers, surely it was worth more. But there's nothing that you could do about it, because you can't encourage higher bids. And therefore, a lot of landlords, what I foresee doing is they're just going to go above market price. So initially, at least, we're going to see rents skyrocket. I promise you, that's exactly what's going to happen. As a landlord, you're going to say, okay, it's 2.5 grand, but just in case, you know what, I want to put it up for 3 grand and see how it plays out. And if they're not, then I at least have the flexibility of bringing it down, as opposed to happening the other way. I hope that's helpful, Andrew. So before we jump on to some other questions, let's continue to go through this property mark breakdown of the Renters' Right Bill. So if you just joined, we've talked a lot about unintended consequences. We've talked about the infinite tenancies, and we've talked about the ban on rental bidding wars. So now grounds for possession. So a 12-month protected period will be introduced at the beginning of the tenancy, which landlords cannot evict tenants. We've talked a little bit about that. So a number of specific grounds will be introduced for the sector, such as a student accommodation, where it is necessary for tenants to move out in order to free up places for eligible occupants. This would also include temporary or supported housing and properties used in the scheme, such as stepping stone accommodation. So when Renters Reform Bill was being considered in the last Parliament, property mark highlights concerns amongst landlords due to lack of confidence and the available grounds that gave you adequate protection. We will work with, okay, so some of those grounds, guys, that does include you getting the property back, and that includes for your own home, selling the property, and I believe also it includes for family members. So as an investor, I don't think it's a huge cause for concern, the removal of Section 21. I think where it becomes a bigger issue, and again, talking about cause and effect, this is going to be a big one, because in addition to rents increasing initially with the whole bidding ban, what I also foresee is those other areas that are not as attractive, that bring typically the wrong type of tenants. A lot of investors are going to keep away from that. And therefore, what's going to happen is there's going to be a lack of supply. I mean, there's a lack of supply across the region anyway. But what we're going to see is these hotspots where it's going to be even worse, because investors, number one, don't want to even enter into that market, because obviously more of those rights are being removed from these investors, number one. Number two, those investors who already have stock in those regions, what they're going to do is going to be so much more careful as to who they rent the property to. And that, of course, who's that going to impact, in my view? The most vulnerable. Most vulnerable being the people who have less affordability, who are considered to be a higher risk. They're just simply not going to be able to secure a property. That's going to put a strain on who? On the government, on the council, on housing association. Again, really sort of opening up the conversation to the real issue, which is it's not landlords that are the challenge here. It's the lack of housing. So let's address the real problem, which is the lack of housing. That's what I foresee seeing. So again, unintended consequences seems to be the real theme throughout this live stream, but also with that government intervention always coming through. So this is also another one. So we've got rent increases and tribunal reform. So currently, what I do know is that tenants can dispute a rent increase. They can take this to the tribunal, and it can be disputed. And if the tribunal believes that it isn't in line with market value, then you won't be able to make that increase. Now, that's going to continue to exist, but they seem to be adding some other elements to it. So, firstly, rent increase must be notified once a year and cannot exceed current market rates. Again, I don't see the difference with that right now. But tenants can dispute increases through a tribunal, which may delay the increase until a decision has been made. So, I think that may be the key difference here, guys. Whereby at the moment, you can apply the rent increase. And to my knowledge, that increase is made effectively. Now, if they take it to tribunal and tribunal decides that actually it's not fair, then that whatever the tribunal decides goes from there on. But I believe that moving forward, this is going to be different. Like you won't be able to increase, and it won't take effect unless a tribunal agrees that this is exactly the amount that you should be that you can increase during the current market. So that's going to be an interesting sort of transition to see how that plays out. And most importantly, how on earth are they going to be able to monitor this and keep up to date? Because this means that any tenant out there, unless they just roll over and a landlord says, I'm increasing your rent by 5% because that's what market value is. And the tenant just rolls over and says, okay, Mr. Landlord, thank you very much for letting me know. And you'll get your increased rent. If the tenant knows that they can put a pause on that rent increase, even if they know that that rent increase is a fair amount, but if they can put a pause on it until the tribunal actually makes a decision, and if that's 3 or 6 months, and then the tribunal says, yeah, that's fair, but that rent cannot take in place until then that's 3-6 months that I've saved myself a fair amount of money. Why wouldn't I do it? I'll do it every time, right? So we have some questions here, and we're just going to drive in to some of these questions. So, great if you're going to say, how does a ban? Okay, I've answered that one. Samantha, are there any fines for non-compliance with the renter's bill? I think I've answered that as well. Would be great to know about the new landlord ombudsman role in resolving disputes between landlords and tenants. Well, if it's going to work anything like the current ombudsman with the agents, which I assume it is, it's very much whereby there is a process. So first of all, there are certain policies and regulations that you have to abide by as a landlord, number one. If you break those policies, then obviously the tenant can make a complaint. And the tenant will also be in a process whereby before they can make a complaint, there is a process that they have to go through with the landlord first. Until then, they won't be able to put a formal complaint. Now, when that formal complaint is made, then the ombudsman will get involved and investigate both parties, come to a conclusion based on that evidence that both parties have presented, and then it goes from there. I don't know if the ombudsman itself has the power to put a fine. And that would be something that we'll be monitoring and be glad to share with you as it comes in. I hope that's helpful, Andrew, for you. Sorry, Stephen. And then we got Leslie, a question. So glad to find you online, Danny. Glad to have you online, Leslie. I've heard about a digital rental database in creation. How will it affect the privacy and operations of private landlords? So that's a great question. So this database is primarily, my understanding, created for the data for councils to make decisions, for councils to be able to monitor certain landlords and their movements as to what they're doing with specific properties, applications, and so forth. So it's primarily for councils. Now, will there be a space in this digital database for public domain? That's going to be an interesting question, and they have not released those details. I'm going to suspect that some of it will be available to the public. Of course, I doubt it's going to be anything sensitive, but whether your name's going to be there, whether you currently have a license, for example, as more legislation comes in, and you need to be compliant and you need to have a license, and so a tenant can just go, if they're making an application for a property, in the same way that a landlord does their own due diligence, the tenant can also do their own due diligence in the fact that, is this landlord actually the owner of this property? Tick yes. Do they have a license to rent this property? Tick yes. So it's kind of leveling up the playing field from a landlord and tenant perspective. It's just not a one-way due diligence. And I can understand that to an extent, guys, because if you think about it, especially here in London, as I shared with you before, you have tenants who are paying 12 months rent in advance, which is a huge amount of money. And there's very little due diligence that they can do easily available to their resources, of course, because of course, yes, they could go to the land registry, pay X amount of money, find out if that is, but then they don't have the ID from the landlord. If they go on and ask the ID from the landlord, they might get offended. And if the landlord has 5, 10 other applicants, they will just go with the less. This way, it kind of cuts everything. But again, is it going to go that way? I don't know. If it did, with a certain amount of public information, I wouldn't see that as being unreasonable. And I hope that makes sense. So it's great that you're asking these questions, because what's happening naturally is that we're going through these changes together with the actual questions themselves. So those rent increases, again, once a year, they're going to have to be market rates, and the tenant can dispute that. And if it's found to be correct, it won't take an effect until the tribunal makes that decision. So let's see what it had. Currently, tenants will be able to challenge increases they believe are above market rate, though the first tribunal plans to increase consumer confidence in this process include preventing the tribunal from recommending a rent higher than the landlord has asked for, and ending the practice of backdating increases. So again, until that tribunal takes place and the tribunal actually says yes, then and up to then and only until then will that take effect. The tribunal will also gain the power to defer increases for a further 2 months in cases of significant hardship. So again, there's going to be some evidence presented by tenants if there are any hardships from that point. Now, one of the reasons they're putting this in place as well, guys, to give this context from my understanding from all the conversations I've had, is that a lot of landlords use increasing the rent substantially as a way to drive tenants out. So the government doesn't want to see a situation whereby, okay, Section 21 is over. I can't get the tenant out if I don't have a reason. Well, how can I maneuver around this? Oh, okay, I know. I'll increase the rent by 20%. Oh, you can't afford it? Well, then you're going to have to leave. They are trying to cover every possible angle for landlords not to be able to manipulate the system, navigate through it, and get their own way. It's a higher level of protection for these tenants, of course. I hope that makes sense and this is helpful, Leslie. So as we go into the Decent Homes Standard and Awaab's law, so Property Mark has long argued that renters in the private sector should receive the same service, standards and protections as those in social sector where Decent Home Standard is already in place, and there is a requirement for property managers to be qualified. I'm going to agree with this one, especially when it comes to property managers being qualified. There are, if you're not aware, over 170 regulations, legislation, however you want to call it, to abide by. It's challenging enough for a professional property manager to keep on top of this, let alone landlords. Unless this is a full-time job, then let landlords, of course, go and take these courses so they're up to date as to what's law, what's legislation, and what's going to be best practice for your tenants. It's ironic that the government is pushing this into the private sector, the Awaab's law, knowing that this had come originally from the social sector. Of course, for you, those of you that are familiar with Awaab's law, it came from a very tragic situation whereby a child did lose their life. And this was, from my understanding, after evidence was found that it was due to mold or damp issue in the property. So I'm sure none of us want to see those type of things, whether it's in the social sector or in the private. But the point I'm making is certainly the social properties, the conditions of social property, in my opinion and what I've seen, are the worst. But it seems they come after the landlords as they go into landlord bashing mode. But I do see a need for this. So it's important that the standard works in practice for different types of property, and that it's adequate time and support is available for property owners to bring homes up to a standard where necessary. And the great thing about this standard is that there is now a benchmark as to what landlords can aim for, and tenants and landlords can agree on that. Because at the moment, for example, if there's a bit of mold, whose fault is it? Is it the tenant because they're not keeping a good ventilation? Is it the landlord's fault because they're not providing good ventilation? It's going to be sort of no grey areas, hopefully, as this comes into play. I don't know if there are any other questions, but one thing I wanted to share with you is, again, it's looking at the tenants and the tenant side of what they believe, whether this is fair or not. And one article I came across, which I found very interesting, was this one from, I believe it was talking about Section 21. No, this is not the one. So it was from Ben Beadle, and he acts, of course, for renters. And I want to try and share this with you as to his view with regard to this renters' right bill coming through. So there's no surprise that Ben Beadle, hopefully you can see my screen, claims that renters' right bill Section 21 ban is not a big change. So Ben Beadle claims that removing Section 21 will not be a significant change for landlords. In an interview with BBC Radio Today program's chief executive said it's unreasonable for landlords to issue a Section 21 without a decent reason. Now, let me just share something with you, just to be okay. Let me just finish this article, because otherwise I'll go on a run. So Section 21 ban shouldn't be a significant change for landlords. Mr. Beadle told the program, he said, "I understand the threat of Section 21 hanging over people's heads where landlords don't need to give a reason. I fully understand why the government is removing Section 21. I think we need to understand that we shouldn't push the needle too far. While it's unreasonable for landlords to issue Section 21 without decent reason, I would argue that if you have a good tenant, you will want to keep them in the property." And he is absolutely right, which was the point I was going to drive. But I was going to go a little bit further on that. So I have no issue with tenants having access to justice. Emma Barnett, the show's presenter. So she claims that there are fears that unaffordable rent rises will become another form of no-fault eviction, which, again, that's not going to happen, because the government is trying to cover all angles so that landlords can't sort of maneuver through this. So he said, "I have no issue with tenants having access to justice. Tenants can readily challenge unfair rent increases through the first tier tribunal." And that is true. That is what's is in place at the moment. So this isn't new, but many don't even know it's an option. And absolutely, it's not new. Tenants currently can take it to a tribunal, but I think there are some small tweaks to that. So I think there is a lack of enforcement. Local authorities have been absolutely decimated in the past decade with regards to funding, and that simply means that the vast majority of landlords have been doing a good job do care about their tenants and have much greater satisfaction ratings in the private rented sector than in the social housing. Totally agree with that. Absolutely. So again, we have the government sort of trying to cover different angles on this. You got the you got Ben Beadle there acting on behalf of tenants, of course, fighting his corner. But then going back to those unintended consequences, we have these articles like this. Stock crisis predicted to worsen as landlords brace for bad news. So this was out just yesterday. And here is sort of that continued exit from landlords, which we've seen for a number of years, not only because of the potential renter reform bill coming in, but also all the other issues and challenges that landlords are facing. So more than 1 in 10 homes for sale on Zoopla in July, that's over 12%, double digit, guys, were formerly rented, prompting fears that a challenging autumn budget could further increase sales of rented homes. So we have the budget, of course, from the Labour government just around the corner. This is on top of this renters' rights bill come in. 21 tenants are now competing for each rental property. That issue is going to get worse if landlords continue to exit the property. Now, I know that one of the government's aim, from what it seems, is to professionalize the industry. What I mean by that, it seems that everything they're doing seems to be for landlords to either exit the market or for professional landlords to enter the market with a structure of corporation. So incorporation seems to be the way forward. Because otherwise it's simply not viable, especially when it comes to the Section 24 implementation. But it seems the government is also betting on the build to rent industry sort of taking over and be able to fill that gap in. But I'm also seeing the build to rent industry kind of pausing and raising concerns around these regulations. So whether those developers and those development builders will continue at the rate they're going for at the moment and they were before, it will be interesting to see whether it will continue or not. Now, even if they did, the other question will be whether, I say question, this is even a question, it's going to take time for this to kick in. So even if that industry and those developers do get the confidence that they want or need, in the meantime, you have these smaller landlords exiting the market. By the time these buildings get up to pace to fill in that gap, you're looking at a good 3-5 years, if indeed that gap can even be filled. Because remember, the amount of buildings that even if the government builds the 1.5 million properties, that wouldn't be enough. We're playing catch up. So we're kind of like always one step, two step behind, even if these buildings do take place. I hope that makes sense. So based on this article, at the back of the bad news for landlords in terms of the new regulation, which, listen, guys, I don't think it's like a huge game changer. There are elements in there that are of concern. And for me, the biggest ones, it's not Section 21, which I've showed you already, seems to be the biggest concerns of landlords. For me, it's how they're going to roll out the first of all, the court system to be up to date for the other grounds for landlords who do want their property back, but also looking at the ban on the bidding wars. That will be interesting to find out. And then the indefinite or infinite ongoing tenancies, how that's going to work is beyond me. Periodic tenancies, pretty much. So rental growth for new lets currently stands at 5.4%. Half the rate compared to a year ago, but still higher than the growth in average earnings of 5.1. While average rents hit £1,200 in the month of July, £63 per month higher than a year ago. Demand is likely to run at above average levels for the remainder of 2024, and it will. with rents expected to be 3 to 4% higher by the end of year, says Azubla. So, decisions. It believes the government's proposal in the Renters' Right Bill are already factored into many landlords' decision on whether exit or remain in the market. So, as we go through this, the question is for those landlords who are entering into the current industry or want to continue to be in the industry, why on earth are they? If I'm, all this scaremongering and this bad news, the question is, but why would you want to stay in the buy-to-let market? And I found this very interesting article that breaks down as to why landlords want to remain in the market despite, the bad news and despite the bad news. So let's look into that article and see if you agree with any of these. Before I do, let me just have a look at James. I know you, Stephen, I know you have a question. I will answer that for you just after we review this particular article that we have here. So we've got this article by Landlord Today. This was published 29th of August, so a couple of weeks ago. What keeps landlords in the buy-to-let business? New findings. For any of you on the stream right now, again, I love taking data, dissecting it, and presenting it. But what I love best is hearing from you guys and your experience. So share with me on the comments below as to what keeps you in the market, if indeed you want to stay, or what keeps you awake at night and why you're exiting the market. So a new survey appears to lift the lid on why landlords remain in the buy-to-let market despite tax and regulations controls. Paragon Bank surveyed 500 landlords with up to 3 properties. So with up to 3 properties. So bear in mind, these aren't necessarily only professional landlords who have a huge portfolio. These are very much sort of accidental landlords that have up to 3 properties. Key findings. So long-term rental demand, 6 in 10 landlords, 60% cited the ongoing demand for rental properties as a key factor in their decision to grow their portfolios. Retirement income, over half of landlords, 50%, 54 are looking to add properties to their portfolios as a means of supplement to their retirement income. So just want to touch a little bit on those two alone. I think the biggest challenge and the biggest change that has had an impact on landlords' pocket is going to be the Section 24 not being able to offset those expenses. And then in addition to that, to add, is it injury to insult, I believe the saying is, then you had the mortgage rates increase substantially. And that's the biggest issue. And therefore, I find that landlords who want to stay in the industry want to perhaps somehow restructure so it can be viable for them and incorporate so it does become something that's worth keeping, because I can see it being a challenge for a lot of especially pensioners who have purchased a property quite a while ago and now they can't offset those expenses. So next up, we've got capital appreciation. Nearly half of respondents, 47%, believe that long-term house prices growth is a significant driver for their investment decisions. And that's a wise one. It's a wise one. Why? Because I know a lot of landlords, especially the newbies, are always after that yield, the high yield. And that's great. If you can achieve that, that's great. But let's think about the buy-to-let industry. And there's not many industries out there when it comes to investment that you're going to invest that's going to hit these 3 buckets, or in fact, any of them. So number one is you being able to have a cash flow whilst you have that investment, okay? That cash flow comes from your tenant. Number 2, that the debt is paying by your tenant, bucket number 2. And then you have capital appreciation, bucket number 3. Those are 3 buckets. And I believe out of the 3, the capital appreciation is where you always win. Is where you're going to win the most. Yes, you may have a little bit of cash flow here and there on a monthly basis, depending on the rates and depending on the deposit you put down. Yet the capital appreciation is where you always win, which I always say property is always going to be that long-term investment which I think applies for any of them, right? So again, what's keeping landlords in the game? So the preference for property. Over a third of landlords, 34%, prefer property as an investment asset over other options. Louisa Sedgwick, Paragon Bank, says the rental market is set for continued growth driven by projected population increases of around 10% over the next decade. This favorable market outlook is underpinning the investment decision of aspiring landlords. And one thing I always say is, especially when it comes to population, so we know that half of the world's population are in urban sectors. So most of them are going to be in major cities. That's half of the population. As the population grows in 2050, they're saying that that existing population in urban areas is going to double. So by my maths, if we currently have a population of 8 billion or give or take, that means that 4 billion of us are living in urban areas. And that's going to duplicate to 8 billion by 2050. So that trend of people sort of moving away from the cities, I think in the masses that probably held true during the pandemic and during that whole, the world is going to end. And that could possibly continue to be true, but I think that is a smaller segment given the data that we're seeing right now. So I hope that this has been helpful. For those of you who've just joined, we have reviewed a few things. I'm just going to give a quick recap. So some of the most important points coming from the Renters' Right Bill. So it's the no fault evictions coming to an end. So goodbye Section 21. The rental increase being challenged by tenants in a tribunal. That's number 2. Number 3, an end to bidding wars, which I believe is going to cause a hike in rental prices. Discrimination. Landlords can't discriminate against tenants based on benefits and having children. Does that mean that you can't get to choose? Yes, you can get to choose who you have in your property investment. It just means you can't advertise and discriminate against this segment of applicants. Now, landlords database, a new database will list all landlords and properties will need to be registered before marketing their properties. And this is a digital database. What is the purpose for this? I believe primarily it is for the council to be able to monitor and gather data, make decisions based on this data. But I also believe there's going to be an element of this that's going to be available to the public. And I'm sure it's not going to be sensitive data, but there will be some element to it. So there is now to add on top of landlords who do believe they're being treated unfairly, that they're losing money, that the rights are being sort of infringed upon. There is now kind of a privacy issue here now for those. So these reforms are expected to be implemented. I believe it's going to be somewhere around about mid-2025, especially when it comes to Section 21. The abolishment, I think that's going to be the first thing they want to remove. It was part of the Labour's, I believe, manifesto, if I'm not mistaken, and the Renters' Rights Bill. So we're looking at this being implemented probably around about summer 2025, if I was a betting man. So I hope this has been helpful. I have one last question here from Samantha. Do we have any exemptions as a small or family landlord in this new renters reform bill? Afraid not, Samantha. I've not heard of any exemptions on this. There is a small exemption for those that seem to have student accommodation when it comes to, and I wouldn't say exemption, it's just kind of a different type of regulation when it comes to the length of the tenancy or asking the tenants to move out. We're adding a link to the description when it comes to you being able to see a guide, an overview of this Renters' Right Bill from Labour. But if you're a geek, a lettings geek like me, and you want to see the full text of the proposal, which is pages and pages upon pages, and you want to read that, that's also on the description, so you can see that link. We always do a live video every week. We're having some guests join us. These are legal experts, mortgage experts, tax experts, whatever expert you can think of in the property field, we're going to have them on. So if you're not subscribed, make sure you do join us, and look out for the next video that's going to be coming out this weekend, because that is an interesting one. And if you're a landlord looking to exit the market, I believe that that's going to be something that's of real interest to you. And then you have one more question here, and then we're done, which is, what do you think will this new bill require us to make energy efficiency upgrades to properties? Not yet, Stephen. Right now, it's not included in the bill, but the government has made clear plans. I think it's our friend, is it Ed Miliband, who doesn't give a great example. I saw him come off, I think it was a great big Range Rover, yet he is out saying, he wants to save the planet. And I believe he has some big plans for energy performance. So look out for that. And there is a video on that as well. I can't remember which one it is, but leave me a comment. I'll be happy to share that link for you, Stephen. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great weekend. Have fun dissecting and going in deep on those on that text for the Renters' Right Bill that we've shared on the description. Take care. Thank you.